Good evening, everyone. You're all very welcome to this installment of our Financial Services Insights webinar. We're delighted that so many of you have been able to attend. We have, I think, over 200 people tuned in to us here at the moment this evening, so it's really quite an extraordinary attendance, so thank you all. I'm certainly under no illusions that the reason you're here is to listen to me, though. And welcome, Martin, for joining us as well. The origins of the Financial Services Insight series really to create a forum that would give our clients an opportunity to hear from and to speak with opinion formers and expert commentators on the issues of the day, and we see that in our role as a wider role as business advisors and counsellors, not just legal technicians. So hopefully providing a forum like this is consistent with that objective. Our speaker this evening is one of the most respected economic commentators and journalists writing today. Martin Wolf needs no introduction, I'm sure, to all of you. His columns in the Financial Times and his published works have been essential reading, really, for those in leadership, in business, and in politics and in society, helping to navigate the I suppose, unprecedented challenges that we've seen really over the last decade, in particular, starting with the financial crisis, then the Great Recession, and now most recently the COVID-19 pandemic. And Martin's views and insights on all of these events, I suppose, really sort of help us to try and make sense of what's happening, and most importantly, to make the right decisions for our businesses and our clients, and for those who work with us. I suppose there's a sense at the moment that these are very significant events, and they're having quite an effect outside of the narrow economic consequences, and probably are leading to more profound, fundamental changes in the structures of our societies. The measures taken to deal with the financial crisis and the Great Recession, they seem to have really sort of amplified the perception that extreme economic polarization really has been steadily developing in the West over the last 30 years, where one small group seems to remain immune to economic shocks and indeed seems to thrive through recessions, whilst other parts of the economy take a disproportionate brunt. And flowing from that, then we've seen a rise in populism with the election of a number of, I suppose, sort of autocratic, reactionary type leaders in what would previously have been seen as liberal societies. Then on top of all of that, COVID-19 arrives. Now, the pandemic is clearly not the result of any economic or political ideology. However, the unprecedented measures taken to deal with it, I suppose, where huge amounts of liquidity have been pumped into the system, dwarfing even what was done during the financial crisis, that seems to carry the risk of perpetuating this systemic dysfunction even further. It's quite extraordinary, really, to see the Dow Jones hit its highest point ever a couple of weeks ago, closing over 30,000 points. That's at a time when the US obviously remains in the grip of the pandemic. Its unemployment rates have increased more in a period of 3 months during the COVID pandemic than across the entire 2 years of the Great Recession. And also the US fiscal deficit has tripled in size from last year. So something surely has become disconnected between the financial markets and the real economy when you see the stock market hit record levels in those circumstances. And against all of this backdrop, we have what appears to be sort of the gradual unraveling of the rules-based order, which brought so much prosperity, initially anyway, to the US and Europe after World War II, and the retreat of globalization, increases in protectionism and nationalism, and I haven't even mentioned climate crisis or even whispers of our Brexit yet, and the rise of China to become a global superpower. So all of this disruption, all of this makes us feel like we're living through an age of significant change. So I suppose, where questions that arise, where is that leading to? What will our societies and our economies look like in another 30 years? Who knows, but Martin's probably one of the few commentators able to weave together really the threads of this tapestry of economics, politics, history and society, and try to help us make sense of all these changes. So the format of this evening now will be an address by Martin first, followed by a Q&A between myself and Martin, and questions from the audience. So I'd really encourage you to take the opportunity to submit those questions. Just submit them on the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll sift through those at the end of Martin's address and take them then as we meet them. So I suppose, having set the scene a little bit, without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Martin. Thank you.
So thank you very much, It's an immense pleasure to be with you, and I look forward very much to the Q&A, which often is far and away the most interesting part of this session, this sort of session. So I am going to try and set the scene in about half an hour. As you will see from what I'm covering, this is pretty ambitious, and there are many interactions that I won't be able to address, and many crucial time periods in terms of how we got to where we are, which I can't address. But I'm going to do my best. And I'm essentially going to divide my remarks into 4 sections, about a little over 5 minutes each. So it is heroic. The first will be crucial, what the world was like before COVID-19 came along, because it was a world in very substantial change, in flux. Then I'll talk about the impact of COVID-19 as we know it now, at the end of what is almost a year, pretty well a year if you count when it hit China. And then I will talk about what lies ahead, or what might lie ahead, in terms of what are sort of the most probable things, the likely things we can think about. And then finally, I'll talk about, in the 4th section, about some extreme risks. My big point, I think, is we are clearly in a period, even by past standards, of extraordinary change and flux in political arrangements domestically, the global order already mentioned, technology and its interaction with both of these things, and economic, social, and even ultimately physical stability for our planet and for ourselves. And these sorts of periods, and I think the last period like this was the interwar period, are really obviously very difficult to understand. But I think the one thing I'm quite sure about is we're not going to go back to something we thought of as usual. And so perhaps before I even start, there's a very relevant comment, because it will inform much of what I say. It's a famous comment of John Maynard Keynes during the Second World War, in which he said, the big difference between us now and us, and he was there, in 1918, was that in 1918, we thought we could put the world back the way it was before the First World War. Now we know we can't go back either to the way it was before the First World War or to the way it was in the interwar period. We have to create something new. And I think, to me, that's true now. I don't know whether we've got this fully in our minds, but after the global financial crisis, I'll come to this in a second, the dominant idea of most policymakers in the West was, let's solve this problem of the financial crisis. Let's solve the problem of the financial system. For the rest, basically, let's go back to the way things were. And I think after COVID-19, that's no longer a plausible strategy. But we will see. So let me start then with the world before COVID-19. Well, first of all, we were very much still in a world marked by and marred by the financial crisis. I don't have the time to discuss why the financial crisis happened. I've written a whole book about it. We can discuss it. But the financial crisis itself was a turning point for the Western world. After it, we never regained pre-crisis growth rates. Particularly, we never regained pre-crisis productivity growth rates. And those themselves were considerably slower than they'd been in the period after the Second World War. Ireland, of course, is a bit of an exception in this story. Its economic history has been very different from that of the large Western countries. But essentially, the financial crisis was a turning point. And after that, generally growth has been low. Growth has been slow. Productivity growth has been slow. There's been a huge debt overhang, which we haven't got rid of, though it's shifted a bit from the private sector to the government sector. And it was a period of malaise in important ways. I'm going to come to that in a moment. The second thing that was going on before COVID-19, which indeed the financial crisis made unambiguously clear, was we had a new superpower. China is not only a huge economy run in different ways, in important aspects, different ways from ours, but the fact that it could go through the global financial crisis, reignite growth, with this astonishing growth in 2009, which pulled with it the whole emerging world, creating for the first time a situation in which the West could have a really deep recession and most of the emerging and developing world was not really affected. That was all because of China. And it gave China an enormous increase in self-confidence. And of course, that was followed then by the rise to power of Xi Jinping, who reestablished an untrammeled autocracy in China based on nationalism and a superpowered aspiration. Now, that was the second huge transformation of the world, which the financial crisis made clear. The third was that I think the financial crisis followed, of course, from a long period of rising inequality in core countries. That goes back really to the 80s. There were many causes for this. I think the most important were a mixture of technology and the shift in the way corporations ran themselves, combined with globalization, but I think that was the least important of the three. But there was basically the old working class was discarded economically and atomized socially. And that then left a very large number of people open to populist appeals of either the left or right. And for reasons that I can't go into now, the right was vastly more successful, focusing on anti-immigration, nationalism, protectionism in various forms. And of course, got to power in America, a decisive event with Donald Trump, and of course in Britain with the vote for Brexit. But these echoes can be seen in many other countries, though not to quite the same way, quite the same extent. And of course, it went in parallel with a rejection of democracy in a large number of emerging countries, which had flirted with or had a certain forms of democracy before the financial crisis, and thereafter shifted away towards this new autocracy. The democratic recession, this is sometimes called, and it has continued to this time. And this, I think this rise of populism, which I've discussed, was enormously reinforced by the financial crisis, and for two reasons. First, a financial crisis is a dramatic presentation of elite failure. It's nobody can avoid the fact, ignore the fact that a large number of core financial institutions on which we all depend collapsed, and worse, they were all rescued by the state or states. So it seemed not only to show extraordinary incompetence, it also showed what seemed to many a completely rigged capitalist system, a system in which the wealthy were saved and ordinary people were sacrificed. And I think that was a pervasive feeling in the US and the UK. The fourth thing that followed COVID-19, followed the financial crisis, was a marked shift in globalization. Before the financial crisis in every aspect: financial capital, foreign direct investment, movement of people, and trade. The international side of our economy was growing faster than the economy as a whole. Everything got more open, and on almost every measure, can go through them all, we had the most globalized economy ever in 2007, far more so on most measures than even before 1914, which had been the previous high point, the previous high point. Since then, globalization has not collapsed, but it has slowed dramatically in all aspects, and in particular trade, sort of driving engine, has been growing overall about as fast as world GDP, instead of growing about twice as fast as world GDP as it did before. And the final fact of the pre-COVID-19 world was the failure to deal with climate change. The obvious fact that we were aware of it generally, we were committed to do something about it, and nothing much happened. So this was not a very happy picture, particularly for the developed world. It was a picture of relative stagnation, huge financial crises. Obviously, the financial crisis here includes the Eurozone financial crisis, about which you know so much. Big political transformations, the twilight of globalization, not the collapse, and this long-running failure to deal with the climate challenges. So these are 5 aspects of the world before COVID-19. So let me then go to what COVID-19 has done in a year. First of all, there is no doubt this is the biggest recession and the most general recession, the most widespread recession, with almost every economy in the world in decline this year, except signally China. There has been since the 30s. And in the latter respect, in the pervasive nature of this recession, probably the greatest disaster ever. So everybody's in recession, not equally so, but everybody has been in recession. The recession is very severe. It now looks, we're in the second wave, so that slowed the recovery. But there's now optimism that next year will be better, and I'll come to this in a moment. But this is an economic disaster. The second thing about it is that some countries have done vastly, despite the obvious fact it's a disaster for everybody, that some countries have done vastly better than others in managing it. And the big headline story, of course, is that East Asia has done much better than the West. After the initial catastrophe, China really throttled this disease and has gone back to normal. But so too, of course, of Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam, Japan, and interestingly, New Zealand and Australia. This is obviously partly an organizational achievement, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that they learned from SARS and responded very, very quickly to the emergence of the disease and managed it far more successfully than the West. And the West has been struggling. Italy, Spain, the UK, France, and notably the US have all had very bad pandemics, both in terms of disease levels, fatalities, and of course, in the economic disaster that has befallen them. The UK is, I think, a signal case in almost every respect. The Western countries have been able to spend vastly, and that has cushioned the blow. But nonetheless, enormous accumulations of debt in the private and public sectors, a long-term legacy. We are now looking towards a recovery next year, and if the vaccines all work, as we all hope they will, it might be quite a strong recovery. But it is pretty likely, not certain, pretty likely, however, that the scars from this immense shock will survive. Most forecasters think we will not get back to the pre-crisis trend, which I've already noted was itself a rather poor trend compared to what we had enjoyed before the financial crisis. But we won't get back to the pre-crisis trend levels even if we get to pre-crisis trend growth. And that probably means, not certainly, that there will have to be fiscal tightening at some point, and that's going to be politically very difficult. COVID-19 has, in addition to this economic legacy, to one other very important legacy, which is that it's exacerbated social divisions. This is a crisis which, because of technology and the radical transformation brought about by technology, has allowed people who do the sorts of things we do really to continue working as if nothing had happened, except that, of course, they've changed where they work mostly. But this has not been true of all the people who rely on face-to-face contact in their work or working side by side, people who care for old people and so forth. And the economic impact and the social impact has been extraordinarily unequal. And of course, the policies that have been chosen, I think rightly, to save us, including these massive monetary and actions, have of course reinforced this by saving the financial markets and restoring financial sector health and health to equity markets, which don't really affect directly most of the population. So not only has it been a huge economic shock and a huge technological transformation, it has exacerbated the social tensions we already had. And that raises some very big questions about the future. That then leads me to my third section, which is where we get to some big questions. Well, what lies ahead? What might the 2020s hold for us, given that we've now been through two pretty huge shocks in 13 years? I mean, that's really a remarkable fact, that just 13 years, from 2007 to 2020, we've been through two enormous shocks, the two biggest shocks since the Second World War. So I'll just go through a number of questions about the future before I go to the risks in my last few remarks. So the first question, obviously, is, Brexit will happen in some form. Donald Trump has been defeated. Does this mean that the genie of populism and authoritarianism, anti-democratic sentiment, and all the rest of it is back in its lamp, and we can assume that normal democratic politics, as we were used to them before the financial crisis, in which educated elites and technocrats basically ran things because it was generally accepted that they knew what they were doing and that they were the right people to do this, and sort of the questions of authority in society, authoritative knowledge in society, the political order in society were essentially not questioned, as they hadn't been since the Second World War. And my own view is it's very unlikely that these ideas and aspirations are dead. I believe that unless we do incredibly much better than seems likely in dealing with the many challenges we confront, which include sort of challenges of managing extremely diverse societies, challenges of managing aging, challenges of managing debt overhangs, private and public, challenges of managing radical technological changes which continue to disfavor, if I may use that word, the relatively weaker parts of our society. If you think those challenges together, the challenges for people who don't go to university and the challenges for many who do go to university, that suitable jobs for them are not available. All these challenges in the context of relatively slow growth are going to be very difficult to handle, and I don't think politics are going to go back to where they were before. And that then links to this second idea we have, that which is floating around, that we should build back better. And part of building back better will be fixing climate. I think there is an aspiration to do that. I think the Biden administration would like to do that. But I suspect there are very, very few countries in which the political will and climate to do this on a large and radical scale, large enough radical, actually exists. I think the rhetoric will be much more significant than the reality, and the changes will be far less profound than they probably need to be. I think we are fundamentally very conservative societies, partly because we're the oldest societies in world history, and partly because the people who are in power actually have done and continue to do rather well. So I suspect that won't change, and that will mean that the political climate, which allows demagogic entrepreneurs to exploit the angry and the embittered, will continue to exist. The third really big issue in the next decade is the US, the West, and China. It's pretty clear to me that China is now trying to establish a sphere of influence globally, which is quasi-imperial in its nature, though uniquely Chinese, essentially a tribute system of a kind, in which countries are allowed to do whatever they like as long as they respect Chinese interests. And Chinese interests are very broad, and they want to control and influence the way other countries behave. It's now perfectly clear the US has committed itself in some sense to confront this, and that's going to create the dominant strategic backdrop to the next decade. And it will mean that for a very large number of countries, they will want sort of ideologically and strategically in some ways to align with the US as a bulwark against China. But they are enormously dependent on Chinese trade and Chinese money and Chinese investment. It's very different, therefore, from the completely different relationship we have with the Soviet Union. This is true for East Asians, of course, and South Asians and people in Australasia, but it's also true for quite a few European countries. Germany basically does as much trade with China as it does with the US, and China is going to grow relative to the US for sure. So this is going to be an incredibly difficult backdrop, and one in which we also need to cooperate with China if you're going to deal with climate, if we're going to keep globalization alive, if we're going to operate a single coherent global system. But that leads me to my fourth point. I think we're going to move further, probably on balance, in the direction of regionalization. In terms of regulation, in many areas, Europe, the US, and China look as though they're moving into different worlds. That's not completely clear, but I think that's very likely. And I think regionalism is clearly becoming more significant in trade. The recent signature of RCEP by China and a very large number of other Asian countries is, I think, very significant. It's the first time China has been embedded in a really big regional agreement. And it is worth remembering that East Asia, certainly includes other, but East Asia is going to be, beyond doubt, the biggest regional economy, bigger than the Americas, bigger than Europe. So this is a very, very important fact. And related to that, fifth area is the fragmentation of world rules. I think that's pretty certain. And the very final thing that lies ahead is, I just more parochially, is where is the UK, EU going to go? I'm assuming still there will be a Brexit deal. I believe that the breakup of the UK is just starting. England and Scotland will separate. I'm assuming myself that over some period, not necessarily my lifetime, Ireland will be unified. And at some point in the distant future, after I'm dead, I would guess the English will realize where they really are in the world. But there are going to be a lot of upheavals in British politics, in English and British politics, on the way to this messy outcome. Finally, in the last few minutes, what are the risks we should be thinking about? So I've painted a sort of picture of some of what I think are the big issues. What are the risks? Well, the first big risk is actually already mentioned in the introduction, that we're going to have a series of financial crises, either modest size one, which will be private sector financial crises and emerging market financial crises after this financial crisis, and or the really big one, which is sovereign debt crisis in core countries. Both of these crises will be triggered, become really serious and be triggered if interest rates rise a great deal at some point. And that would require either a big surge in inflation or a big rise in real interest rates. Neither of these seem high probability events in the near future, the next decade, but they're not zero probability events, very much higher than that. And one can imagine circumstances in which these things will happen. We could discuss that. But there's clearly big risks. The second big risks is that the conflicts that I've described lead to what they've often led to in the past, which is war. There's actually fighting between great powers. The really important thing that didn't happen in the last 70 years, 75 years, was a direct war among the great powers. I suspect that to continue, that we will avoid direct war between the great powers, but given their arsenals and their suspicion of one another, one can never rule it out. And it came pretty close with the Soviet Union on a number of occasions. The third thing that has to be stressed is we are still vulnerable to mega terrorism, including dirty bombs. I'll just park that for the moment. We shouldn't forget it. But I think the far more interesting issues are system vulnerabilities, effective cyber attacks, effective attacks on the internet systems that we depend upon for everything. But system vulnerabilities, of course, include financial crises that I've already mentioned, further pandemics, much worse pandemics. As I pointed out last week, the remarkable thing about COVID-19 is how a relatively mild pandemic, in many respects, viewed in terms of its fatalities, has caused such mayhem. And what would happen with a really serious pandemic, one equally infectious and far more fatal, and particularly one that was fatal to the young. I mean, then we really would close down. So that. And finally, I think we shouldn't avoid the possibility of major political upheavals. I've already discussed the UK. I'm reasonably confident about the future of the EU, but not 100%. There are a lot of tensions there. And it's pretty obvious there are some very, very large tensions in the US, which is a deeply riven society. And I actually think there's far more tension within China than most people realize. And I think the Xi Jinping regime reflects that. And finally, I expect personally that we will not get a hold of climate in the next decade. It will become, therefore, quite obvious by 2030 that our temperatures are going to exceed very substantially what the scientists regard as safe. And we're going to have to start adapting very, very fast to an environment which is changing very, very quickly because we've been too slow in confronting it. And I fear the opposition in Congress to what Biden wants to do on that will be decisive in that regard. So I have summarized my view. Not possibly quite as cheerful as you would like, but I think I've covered a very large number of realities in our world. And as I said at the very, very beginning, and I'll return to now, I do think we are now in one of those decisive hinge periods in the world in which domestic political transformations, technological transformations, and shifts in great power relationships. And at the backdrop to this, in addition, these huge global commons threats, above all from climate, are coming together to require from us a degree of wisdom, cooperation, sobriety, and good sense, which right at the moment does seem to be rather beyond us. So thank you for listening.